Sono molto contenta, grazie. So, Benjamin, how are you? Is it not possible to hear you? You have to switch on the audio.
I am so sorry.
Don't worry. We were just thinking about something that could have been happened. So we said, okay, don't worry. That's fine. I knew that you wrote to us this morning, so you were totally aware of the lunch seminar, so don't worry. So I was just introducing you, and I was just saying that you are assistant professor of ethnomusicology and international affairs at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Most of your research focuses on ideology and expressive culture in contemporary radical nationalist, populist, and neo-fascist movements. And you are also the author on these topics of two very recent and really fascinating books. The one is Lions of the North, Sounds of the New Nordic Radical Nationalists for Oxford University Press in 2017. And the other one is 2020, so super recent, War for Eternity, the return of traditionalism and the rise of the populist right. I don't want to use more time. Professor Teitelbaum is, as I said, one expert on topics that are usually of strong interest also in our department. And my interest in his research, and this is also why I invited him as a speaker in our lunch seminar series, was also concerning his approaches, so his ethnographic approach, qualitative research approach to the national radical right. So the idea was also to listen to him according to the challenges and advantages of using ethnographic approach vis-a-vis actors which usually are very difficult to be accessed for social scientists and anthropologists and others. So, Benjamin, the floor is yours. I don't know if you want an help, but first of all, thank you for coming and thank you for accepting the invitation. As you might know, probably the Scuola Normale Superiore, our political science sociology department, is a department strongly focused on research. We are specialized, let's say, in social movement studies. We have also a big research center within the school, focusing on political participation of several different kind of movements, the progressive ones, but also the nationalist, racist, and xenophobic ones. So in terms of audience, you will probably have most of our PhD students listening to you now, and we also have a discussion, Måns, who is doing a PhD project, is conducting a PhD project exactly on the type of actors that you are usually focusing on. But Måns can explain this better. So, Benjamin, floor is yours. Do you have a PowerPoint that you want to upload?
Yes, I do. But first, the reason, and I have to apologize, the reason that I'm late is we are having a windstorm. I'm very high in the mountains in Colorado, and we have had our power knocked out over and over again this morning. So I'm going to skip the PowerPoint in the hopes that if my internet connection is a little shaky, that might make things easier.
Okay. But are you able to do the talk anyway, or do you prefer to?
I will.
I'm sorry if I didn't give you the chance to tell something before I start immediately to intro. Do you want to give the talk, or you prefer to
yes.
Go? Okay.
Tell you what, I'm going to give it a shorter conversation.
Okay.
And in a boiled down presentation, I'll talk about my work, I'll talk about my history, but especially about the methodology as well. And maybe that will leave more time for discussion and conversation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And Måns, jag antar att du pratar svenska också. You will respond after I've finished speaking. Okay, sounds great. So, well, welcome everyone. It is such a pleasure to be speaking to you all. I had the pleasure, as Manuela mentioned, of meeting her virtually earlier last year, and I'm very, very impressed and excited by the work that you're doing in your program. I tell people whenever I'm introducing myself, I tell them that I am a scholar of the radical right, and typically then a following question is, well, I see that you're a music scholar. And why would someone who is a music scholar be a scholar of the radical right? Shouldn't that be the domain of political science? My response is always that anyone who wants to study the post-war radical right needs to be a music scholar a little bit, at least a little bit. It's because so much of the post-war activism of the radical right in the West in particular, in Western Europe and in the United States, it has not centered on political parties, on elections, on quantifiable data surrounding support from voters. It has focused on expressive culture. The reason for that, of course, is that the cause itself in many of these settings is hopeless. Things vary a little bit in Italy, of all places I would be speaking to. Things vary in Hungary. But generally, the radical right has understood itself as having no chance of formal political power in the democratic sphere. And therefore, it has turned toward alternative means either of activism or at least living out its self and its political life in the absence of a chance for parliamentary or democratic success. In my case, I focused on one of the countries in Europe that had been a sort of holdout for right-wing populists in government, where that dynamic I was just describing was especially sharp, Sweden. Sweden did have a sort of right-wing populist party in its government for one session in the early 1990s. But its reputation in Europe going into the 2010s, let's say, was as one of the countries that was a great holdout against intolerance, whereas Denmark, whereas Norway had seen nationalists, xenophobic nationalist parties break into their parliaments and start to change their political spectrum. Sweden, the social democratic fortress, had kept the far right out. And the political parties that existed were small, feeble, clumsy, goofy. At the same time, however, as Sweden saw profound immunity almost to the far right in official politics, in the underground, Sweden was the site for an absolute blossoming of far right activism and expressive culture. The white power music scene in Sweden seems per capita to have been one of the absolute largest in the world. Their opinion surveys, let's say from 1997, were showing that almost 1 out of every 5 high school boys were listening to white power music sometimes or often. That's a number that was shocking relative to Sweden's official political profile, but also likely distinguished the country and the population from others throughout Western Europe and North America. And the sheer number and volume of white power music bands that were producing music in Sweden likely outnumbered all of those in the rest of Scandinavia and the Nordic countries by a factor of 3 or 4. It was a huge center. Its music producing industry was on par with that of the United States and Germany, far larger countries in the 1990s, and its output was also more vibrant. All of this, of course, was a byproduct of the fact that Sweden had a blossoming skinhead scene, a violent skinhead scene. It did not have the political correlation to a moderate populist political scene, but it had that revolutionary scene in excess.
Benjamin,
yes.
I interrupted. You didn't upload any PowerPoint, right?
No PowerPoint.
Okay, that's better. Not because I wanted just to inform you that we are not seeing any PowerPoints at the time.
No.
Okay,
yes.
okay.
I don't want to stress my internet connection since it's shaky. So, okay. So anyways, that is the background. That is the background. And in 2010, I came to Sweden. I was planning to study something entirely different as a graduate student. As an ethnomusicologist, I was going to study Swedish folk music. And when I came to Sweden in 2010, it was at the very, very beginning of a profound transformation in Sweden's politics, when in fact, a right-wing political party, Sverigedemokraterna, or the Sweden Democrats, had just entered parliament. They had a very, very small share of the vote, just above 4%, just above what they needed to get into parliament. 5.7%, I think, was their actual total. But that was enough to get them into parliament and thereby to break this barrier to the far right in one last bastion of social democratic rule in Europe. This was a party, the Sweden Democrats, that had ties not only to the extremist ideologies that had blossomed in Sweden for decades, but also which had social ties to that world, to that skinhead world. The story is told, I think, not by talking about how people appear, but looking at demographics of the ruling leading circle within the party. It was dominated by white men in their 40s, which was to say, white men who were teenagers in Sweden in the late 1980s. Which is to say, finally getting around to this, the generation of young white men in Sweden who, especially in rural settings, were very much swept up with the skinhead white power wave. And but they had reformed themselves. Few of them were actual bona fide skinheads who shaved their heads. A few of them were, but a lot of them were still peripheral to the skinhead movement. And they no longer were, and they were seeking to refine themselves now that they had power. And where our paths crossed was in music. And that very, very first fall, 2010, when they had broken the barrier into parliament, they said that they wanted to fund Swedish folk music. That was one of their first causes. And I was interested in that because I was there to study Swedish folk music. This introduced me to the fact that that these nationalists continued to be interested in expressive culture. They announced their initiative to fund Swedish folk music before they talked about formal plans for immigration policy. Of course, they weren't going to have any power, but they were just announcing their initiatives. But one of the first things they wanted to do related to music. And as years would go by, as I began studying them and my research shifted, I saw that this interest in folk music was part of a broader campaign to rebrand themselves, to use music to show that they were not skinheads, they were something else. And you don't do that through policy proposals. You certainly don't do that through showing contempt toward migrants and minorities. That won't do that profiling work for you. Instead, you need to do it through identity, in your own identity. That was my initiation into this. It was my initiation into not just musical politics, but also a topic that looked at the internal rebranding of this cause, that was less interested in some of the other topics. The way that I decided to study these groups was through ethnography. That was how I was trained as an ethnomusicologist. Not to study musical texts and artifacts that were disembodied from the people who produced them, but instead to study the actual people themselves in dialogue with their expressions. So I began to interview members of the Sweden Democrats first and foremost. And I anticipated that it would be a sort of journalistic interview process. At the time, I had gone through all of this training in graduate school that described ethnography, the long-term embedded research with the people who you're writing about, who described it as a sort of love affair with the people who you study. So often ethnographers study people with whom they sympathize with politically, socially, even personally. And I never liked that as a graduate student. I don't like compulsory love. I don't like being told that I must love somebody. And part of me thought, you know what, I like this new topic that I'm going to switch to because I'm going to study these people who I do not love and who I do not like. And but as time went on, that all became rather complicated. I am left-leaning. I'm part Jewish. I of course, have ways in which I'm not a pure stereotype, but I'm not going to be the most sympathetic voice when speaking to and meeting these nationalists. But as my interviews progressed, and by progressed I mean they became less formal, actually, as I came to spend not only raw interview time with people who I was studying, but also informal time with their friends and family. Of course, you get to know them, and some of them you also form friendships with. And that was the case in my research with these far-right actors as well. And what makes matters worse, almost you could say, was that those friendships and that deepened connection really was a sort of necessity for ethnographic research. It became indispensable to the types of conclusions and the type of data that I was able to bring to my research. It helped me be able to describe my topic, the rebranding of the far right, thanks to music, in more specific terms and with greater clarity and insight than I would have been able to otherwise. And as time went on, I began to think of myself as an ethnographer, like all ethnographers, that I was studying this particular population in unremarkable ethnographic ways, embedding myself, becoming close to them, letting them become close to me. The difference in my case is that this coexisted with political opposition to who they were. And those features of the research merely coexisted. They were never reconciled, and they're not reconciled to me today. And I can certainly talk about more of that in a question and answer session later. But as a scholar, I've decided that the way to deal with that is simply to report it all to the reader. Because I know that there are many other colleagues of mine who do similar research, but do not talk about relationships they've formed with the people that they're studying. The difference in my case is that I try to make a theoretical point of it in saying that this outcome is necessary to what I'm doing. I'll stop my narrative about method there, and we can perhaps talk about that more in a question and answer exchange. However, as my research progressed, as years passed by, I studied from 2010 into 2013 and beyond with Sweden's far right. That initial example that I saw in 2010, where these far right parties were turning to folk music to rebrand themselves, there was a wider story. That was just one example of a broader phenomenon and trend. As you went outside of the Sweden Democrats, as you went to more militant groups, as you went to, let's even say, less politically successful parties, more ideologically extreme parties than the Sweden Democrats, you saw other uses of music also working toward a rebranding. The one type of music that was not being produced in great numbers and where there wasn't a lot of emphasis was skinhead white power punk music, the music that defined the far right in the past. I saw in certain groupings rap being used as a new type of music. I saw reggae, white nationalist reggae, being produced by Swedes. The purpose of these expressions was not just to be comical and gain attention, but also to try and rebrand the white nationalist cause, in this case, as a fight against oppression, as one instance in a broader pushback against liberal Western hegemony. Very much on par with and in solidarity with Black nationalism. We saw also in circles that were more directly in the lineage of white power neo-Nazi skinhead scenes, a rebranding to include the music of women. In my PowerPoint presentation, which I really do not think I should load up, I had some sound examples of a rise of softer sounding white power music that employed gender identities, namely a singer named Saga, who I followed rather closely in my work as well. The purpose of that, again, of that music was to frame the white power cause as one defending people in despair, defending a population that was threatened with genocide, as opposed to a chauvinistic, aggressive, hypermasculine ideal. Finally, having followed all of these musical expressions led me to some broader characterizations of the far right. We could observe the fact that across various factions of that ideological world, which has real differences in my mind, there was a common aversion to their social and cultural past, a common desire to break into a new identity and rebrand themselves. And why were they doing that? It was a story that is now known, I think, to everyone across Europe and throughout the world. The far right suddenly had something to lose from being outcasts and marginalized. And they had something to gain from rebranding themselves as more respectable, more likable actors in public politics. The far right cause had a chance to govern, and in many cases around the world, it succeeded in that effort, becoming either parts of coalitions or seeing its foremost leaders rise to positions of power. Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil, being Viktor Orban in Hungary to a lesser extent, because of those dynamics, being examples of that. In other words, we could trace this whole story, in my mind, the opening of interest in folk music, the rebranding of far-right expression, to a changing political tide, where the far-right no longer understood itself as being an outcast, but potentially having a claim to the future of the nations in which it operated. That has been my work, to follow that particular pathway, to pay attention to detail, to see how expression is taking place and why, and also how it manifests in the lives of the people who are living it and perpetuating it. If it is okay, Manuela, I will leave my presentation there. I like speaking, but I like conversations more, so I will turn things over to Måns and hopefully thereafter a discussion with your students.
Okay, of course, thank you, Benjamin, and thank you for your clarity, as always. And of course, we can open the general discussion and start with Måns' comments, also because you have already circulated your paper, so in terms of the content and more substantial details, the students can have they have the chance to go back to the paper if they want to know more about the content of the research. So, Måns, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Benjamin, for both for the paper and for this presentation. I know about your work since earlier, but it's very nice to get a face on it.
Likewise, Måns.
So like I said, I enjoy this work that you do, and I really sympathize with the idea of approaching the radical right from a different standpoint than the usual sort of extremist sectarian narrative, or on the other hand, the populist party narrative. My project also touches upon elements of the history of the Swedish radical right, and to me, it's perfectly obvious that this turn away from an expressive movement toward more of a sort of directly political movement is extremely important if we are to understand how the movement has developed and what it's doing right now. So not to keep you too long, I want to speak about three things that I find especially interesting in your work. First, of course, we need to speak about the methodology, because this is this is what I imagine usually provokes most most reactions from other people.
Yes.
And to me, there is nothing really that controversial about it. I agree that it's probably necessary that we do approach the movement in a different way if we are to be able to understand it and to produce new knowledge that doesn't follow so closely upon these sort of mainstream journalistic narratives that we usually have to rely on, or in the case of Sweden, the work of Helene Lööw, which is good but limited because it's only a single narrative. And I also think that you open larger methodological discussions when you talk about your ability to build relations with these people. We know that paying attention to our emotions and our emotional attachments is something that is incredibly important in doing ethnography, especially, but essentially any kind of face-to-face qualitative interviews. And one part of this, of course, is the way in which we relate to our subjects as outsiders or as insiders or something like that. Usually those discussions are only made in terms of means of access to information. But what I think you show is that your status as an outsider also forms part of your ability to make relations or to build positive relations with these people. And I'm curious about that, if you want to expand on it.
Can you? Oh, go ahead. I don't know if you're going to ask more questions or if you want me to speak to that.
I would like to ask some more before that, if that's okay. Yes. Just to take everything at once. Then notes. Second, in terms of your empirical results, I really like how the combination of the paper that you circulated and this presentation, and also the book that you wrote or that you published, how they sort of bind together these individual narratives in the case of Saga, the development of the culture, the development of the movement, and of course the development of society at large. And I have some questions there about the radical right in relation to this. The first question is about the role of the white power music scene as sort of an internal career infrastructure in the radical right, because as you noted several times, the cultural industry within the radical right it's essentially its only source of income, or at least its main source of income by far. This also meant that at least some people could sustain themselves and sustain their activist careers by essentially working within the radical right. I would also imagine that these are people that are sort of left off the wagon when the movement makes its turn toward more sort of mainstream strategies. So I would be interested in hearing something about how these people deal with this, and if you've seen any of it through your work. Second, the relationship between the overall sort of political opportunity structure, which is the word that we would use, and the development of the music scene. In the narrative that you present, the main explanation you give for the decline of the skinhead white power music movement is essentially the opening up of political opportunities. So the fact that all of a sudden the far right has something to lose because they can actually gain electoral support. But what about the other factors that may have produced this decline? I'm thinking especially about all of these other factors that actually weakened parts of the radical right. Just off the top of my head, I would also think about the increasing repression against the skinhead movement throughout the early 2000s, the radicalization of parts of the skinhead movements in that same time, and also, of course, the appearance of file sharing and the way in which file sharing essentially killed off the record labels. And And then also just the fact that the Sweden Democrats arrived as a successful moderate flank that could suddenly compete with the radical flank of the movement. But these are just sort of general impressions from me, and I would be curious if you could just expand on some of the other factors that produced this development. And now I will allow you to answer.
Those are wonderful questions, Måns, and it's a real treat for me to get questions of that specificity, really pertaining to my work. Can I just take them in order? So the first thing that you asked was really about my outsider status as an ethnographer and what role that plays. I'm an outsider to the people I study in a number of ways. Of course, I'm a political outsider with a few qualifiers to it, but a political outsider, and I'm a national outsider as well, being an American. Even though it's really kind of sad how obsessed I am with Sweden, how much time I spend studying Swedish history and language and things like that. But I'm an American. I've never really counted myself a Swede, and sometimes a social outsider to them. A lot of them, later commented to me that if I were in Sweden, they could tell that our worlds would not cross. I think which was their way of telling me that I was kind of a cosmopolitan, urban, liberal-seeming type, and that matters too. And then also an outsider in certain settings, especially the purely race ideological wings, the more revolutionary and radical wings of the radical right. I was an outsider by appearance too. Plenty of people were not shy in telling me, either because of my last name or because of the way that I look, that they could tell that I'm not really one of them. One person started a blog for a while that described a racially suspect American researcher in Sweden to do work, and that was me. So, which is odd, which was a strange sensation. In the United States, I would never question my status as being white, but in Sweden, suddenly I was not quite white in their eyes. So what does all of that do? I think it's important to remember, I think especially as we look back on the history of ethnography, so much of it has actually been about communications and observation, surveillance, if not also dialogue and collaboration across difference. In the initial phase of ethnography, this was very much tied in with its colonial roots. The fact that you had the white, empowered, wealthy West studying the rest. Oftentimes a male researcher, though not always, studying people whose lives were profoundly different. And we look back on that today, and we can see racism, exoticism, fetishization, all of these things that are worth distancing ourselves from. It's easy also to miss the fact that sometimes that difference can be also integral to the knowledge that's being produced, and some of the virtues also that can exist in ethnography. And it's in that respect that I think it's differences worth seeking out still today in ethnography, even if it's difference of a different kind. I felt like I had insights into this particular right-wing scene that I would not have been able to have gained had I been studying it in the United States. Some of that has to do with the fact that in the United States, I view myself as being part of the same political unit, and I feel more imperative to fight against people. I would have had a really hard time studying the Tea Party in the United States, which was going on at the same time, impartially, or at least being interested in things other than their political position, official political position. So that helped. And also, though, the fact that we were able to have conversations, sameness, being identical, is not a great foundation, I think, for having interesting conversations with people at a very basic level. So I think a lot of the differences that existed as an outsider really made a lot of our exchanges richer than they would have been otherwise. To move quickly through your questions, so the white power industry as a career generator. I love the way that you put that. Someone wants to, what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be a right-wing radical. Well, the way that you do that is to become a musician. That was the case in the 1980s and 90s. It wasn't to become a politician. That wasn't very gainful at the time. And in Swedish nationalist history, some of the wealthiest figures, if they weren't musicians themselves, they were involved in the production of music. Peter Melander, Daniel Friberg, these were figures who really did live off their work, and it was music journalism or production in that case. But if I can combine the last two questions that you asked, when that started to fall, you saw some of the same figures also navigate the change. And what replaced white power music as a generator of funds was both being part of a political party that was successful enough to get state support, but also journalism. And thereafter, after journalism, Sweden, of course, if you're large enough, will give you subventions to fund your journalistic activities, and some people on the far right were able to do that. But eventually also intellectualism. Some of the same figures in Sweden who worked in the white power music industry transitioned to forming book presses and publishing primarily intellectual literature. What is interesting to me is that this not only sustained their economic support, but it also was participating in the rebranding of the cause. I talked earlier about how music itself, different types of music were used to rebrand far-right activism. It's also true that non-music and an overall rejection of music was part of the rebranding. In place of it, practical politics and intellectualism, a sort of fetishized nouveau riche intellectualism. A lot of these figures changed their profile, Facebook profile pictures to have pictures of books around them, like they're all sitting in an English library. But the message is that far-rightists are no longer concerned with passion and revolution, which would be more suited to music. Instead, they're thinkers, strategists, and so a lot of them made the transition away from music altogether to intellectualism. And there's a new industry to support that. Arctos Publishers. It's one of the largest far-right publishers in the world. It also comes out of Sweden, comes out of the same people involved in the far-right music industry. When we talk, to your last question, Måns, when we talk about the decline of skinhead subculture, you hit what I think and what the scene itself seems to understand as being the primary factor, and it is not specific to the white power music scene, which is file sharing. One of Sweden's largest labels, white power labels, Midgård, for a long time was running a campaign against file sharing, specifically because it thought it was killing out the white power music industry and not allowing them to produce any new music. So that's a huge factor. The second thing, which is also not specific to the far right, has to do with oppositional youth subcultures in general. I think it's tempting to think that each new generation will have its own music-based youth subculture, but a lot of historians of subculture also think that really had its heyday as a social phenomenon in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And that as really that generation aged out of youth subculture, it wasn't actually replaced with another musical subculture. Instead, social media really replaced music as a meeting place to form alternative communities in Western postmodern liberal societies. And that certainly seems to be the case in Sweden. A lot of commentators have been waiting for a sort of retro revival of skinheadism in Germany, in Great Britain, and in Scandinavia, and that really has not happened to the same extent that we saw earlier. So those are all figures. I don't think that the repressive measures should be numbered among the features that we've just talked about now: file sharing and the aging out of skinheadism, out of subculture. We've seen states with even more robust repressive measures than Sweden. Let's say Germany is the key example. It almost, the anti-Nazi laws, the hate speech laws in Germany have almost led to a more vibrant, dare I say, more entertaining far-right musical subculture than we saw in other places, where there's now this secret code language to evade censors that makes the music more interesting than it might have been otherwise. All these other ways of talking about Hitler and Nazism that skirt around the censors. So I don't think we want to ascribe that power to it. The one caveat I would say is the German authorities' early ability to crack down on far-right music in social media file sharing apps and digital platforms like Spotify. I'd have a hard time thinking that had no impact on the circulation of far-right music. You could go into Germany, if you listen to far-right music on your Spotify, police could come and find you, find your cell phone for having done that. So of course that has an impact, but I think the broader things are really more important.
Okay, Benjamin, thank you very much. I don't know if Måns, you want to add something, or you have concluded with your comments?
No, I think I'm done with my comments. I just want to thank you for those answers. I especially find it fascinating to think about this sort of mutually reinforcing process between the change in possible careers within the movement and the institutionalization process. So these things, sort of the individual level and the meso level, very strongly reinforce each other.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions, Måns.
Thank you, Måns. Are there other questions or curiosities that you want to ask to Benjamin? Or, I mean, not all of you, of course, focus on the radical right, but most of you will use ethnographic or plan to use ethnographic approaches for their object of research, for their investigation. So I'm thinking, for instance, Laura, excuse me if I mentioned you wanted to use for sure ethnographic approach and others. So I don't know if you want to ask us something, let's say, adopting and adapting to your object of research, what have you discussed so far with Benjamin?
Maybe I do have a question, if I may.
Okay, Francesca, go.
Hello, Benjamin. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation, and I actually also pretty much enjoyed the paper. I mean, I'm not asked. So I have a question about the methodology exactly, and the came is more of a probably reflection. So I would like you to basically reflect with me, because while you were describing basically how you access and enter the field and so on and so forth, and how actually also reflect your building up relationships and friendships and so on and so forth was actually crucial to basically also nuanced and fine-grained your results and your research, breadth and focus, basically. I was wondering, because of course this would be something that, I mean, when you study as an ethnographer progressive movements in which you with whom you are sympathetic with, this would definitely be one of those paradigms that are also super important in participatory action research, for example. But of course there is then at that point when you got into so closer, there is also kind of an ethical question about reciprocity. So of course what you can get from the movement, how this is important and how the relationships are important for you and from your research, but then what you give back to the movement, the groups, the band, and the scene, in this case, the subcultural scene in general. And of course, I mean, I think this is an ethical question that can be important. Of course, it raises more question when you study certain type of movement or extreme and radical groups, which of course you don't really want to mainstream or help in any way whenever you are doing your research. So my question and my curiosity is exactly how this could be done and how you can deal with this type of things, even using an emic approach to movement and ugly movements that you wouldn't like from your personal political standpoint. Thank you.
Okay, these are wonderful questions. Manuel, I have to compliment you on how wonderful these questions are. Okay, and this is something I've written a lot about. Let me start by saying this, Francesca. When I started research, I did not like the imperative to reciprocity. And my thinking wasn't that theoretical, it wasn't that sophisticated. I just felt like it was a little too precious for me. It was a little too self-righteous sounding among all my ethnomusicology colleagues, and presumptuous also, that reciprocity would be a good thing and something that we would want to do. So again, there was a little bit of that kind of trickster incentive to me in my mind when years later I suddenly found myself ready to do ethnographic research with the far right. And here's the odd thing, is that reciprocity came into my research kind of through the back door. It didn't happen because I wanted it to happen. All of a sudden I found myself reciprocating in ways that I hadn't planned to because I had formed the relationship. And it made me later on, when I started to think more seriously about this, suspect that collaboration, reciprocity, engagement is one of the other terms we used, activist anthropology, that all of those things ought to be viewed as a sort of byproduct, not quite involuntary, but almost an involuntary byproduct of having formed the relationships that we otherwise think are essential to ethnography. How did that manifest in my case? Well, when I spent so much time with a person, let's say, a group of people, when we start to become friends, when I start to learn things about their lives that may have to do with their status as far-right politicians or may not, I start to be endeared to them in a certain way. They start to learn things about me and they start to become sensitive to my life and whatever it is that I've got going on. And I ended up reciprocating in ways that were not tied to politics, clearly, in some cases. You know, it could be the sort of things that we do with other friends, where you sit up all night listening to them and give them someone to talk to about their problems. You know, I've had members of parliament, powerful people in Sweden right now, up all night crying to me on the phone. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with, you know, it's just a sort of friend reciprocity. That's fairly harmless. A next step towards something that was problematic was when, let's say, the singer Saga, who I wrote about in the article that I distributed, when she was invoked by Anders Behring Breivik, the terrorist in Norway, as having been an influence on her. I also got to know her very well. And a lot of media portrayals of her after the attacks in Norway, I thought were saying things that were just unjustified. You know, it wasn't a political opposition per se. It was just, you know, a journalist writes X and I think X is wrong. And I went out of my way to defend her in a couple of places. I did that in a radio interview and I did it in a few articles that I wrote, some public writing. And I don't regret that because I felt like I was correcting something that was wrong that was being said about her. On the other hand, these debates about the far right are such that a voice pushing back on behalf of the far right can be seen as normalizing in some way. And there's a broader discussion to have about what normalizing and platforming is. But nonetheless, the most concerning thing that I ever did was someone who really a militant neo-Nazi. Måns probably knows his name, Magnus Söderholm. Söderman. Sorry, it's been a while. He's a militant neo-Nazi in Sweden, well known. He's actually banned from traveling to Russia. That's how bad he is. But we became kind of close. He's a very strange person I've come to find, and he once asked me for feedback on his writing. He thought that I was a good writer. And he asked if I could correct and give comments on a piece of writing that he had done. And he had already published a book. It was a novel about white oppression in Sweden. And I was really frozen for a while. Am I going to give this guy writing feedback? And I thought, well, it's not a future piece of writing. It's not that I'm serving as an editor for new text. It's just commenting on something that he already writes, but I'm going to make him a better writer. Is this going to help his activism? On the other hand, am I going to say no to this person because I think he's only going to use my words for bad and that he could never possibly use good writing in his entire life for something good? I ended up doing it, but not feeling that great about it. Right? And I'm not sure what I don't know how I feel about it today. And that's, to me, the outcome of this. It's somewhat self-serving and defensive, but the outcome is that ethnography is not the place to hold a political and moral line. Ethnography is about chaos. Ethnography is about surrendering control to the people that you study. And I think that anthropology and ethnography have been foolish to think that it would be a good place for political activism. I almost think instead, I hope that ethnographers are politically active and care about the world and care about their authority. But I almost feel like they should do it because they know that their ethnography is not going to be the place for it. You know, perhaps you accrue some guilt as an ethnographer that you then are more motivated to go out in the world and work against outside of ethnography. But in these relationships, you do not have that type of control, I think, if you're doing your work correctly. So it's a long response, Francesca, but I've also written a big controversial article about this, so I have a lot to say. I'll stop there so I don't talk too much.
Thank you for the reply. It was very informative.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Francesca. Are there other questions?
Yes, actually, I would like to jump just in
yes,
this last idea that Benjamin just shared us. Thank you also for your interesting presentation. And I would like to. I didn't have the chance of reading your article, but now I really want to get more to dive into some of the things that you have published. And I just want to jump into the last sentence that you said, because I think that yes, I also agree that ethnography, I mean, it's quite polemic because I come from this school. I mean, I was trained as an anthropologist in Colombia, where there's a big division between like being an active, like a political engaged anthropologist or sociologist, or a more leaned like objectivist, let's say, kind of disciplined anthropologist in the standards of what a scholar should be. So I have like dwelled into these dilemmas, I think, for some time, but I want to say that I understand and in a way agree with what you just said, that ethnography is not just for registering the emic perspectives or just to critically applaud what you are being experiencing and what you are being exposed to. It's not that. It's more like to, as far as I understand it, to comprehend the world and the phenomena in a more complex way, where you take this emic perspective, but also you can, as a trained ethnographer, you can bring some other elements in order to add more complexity. So I completely agree with this idea of ethnography is chaotic, but I don't know. I just want to I want to ask you. Maybe you can give us more input on this. Like, how do you read the idea, the fact that this that the far right in Scandinavia and Sweden have taken this let's say rhythms that are like historically rooted into subalternized communities, and they have a very historical colonial history, you know, like how I want to ask really concretely, in your perspective, bringing the ethic perspective, not the emic, but you are as an ethnomusicologist, if it's really the way that they take these genres is really a way of just rebranding themselves as preaching love and, as you said, or solidarity to Black movements, for example, or the Black history, or the other way around. It's a very radical kind of unconscious way of cultural appropriation that is diminishing all this. I was just wondering about this. Like, it's
Yeah.
either they are taking it and they want to say that they're being solidar, and they want to mainstream this by other popular mainstream genres that are more commercial and are easier to get people, audiences that can connect with it, or it's rather a more radical way of being racist and cultural extractivists. I don't know. I was wondering about that.
Yes, it's again a very provocative topic, just in general, and my focus in the book was really about the internal debate that it sparked within the radical right. And the reason that I focused on that was because I was interested in how the right was trying to reconceptualize itself. That was the broader purpose of what I was doing. So I didn't, as a scholar, go into that topic as much as I think I should have, really. The one foray into it that I made was also prompted by the insider's discussion, but it was to observe the fact that there was, for example, sorry to be back. There was a pushback against rap and reggae that said, "Oh, we can't. How dare you make Black music? You Swedish white nationalists. You need to make good white music, and good white music is punk and heavy metal." Not reflecting on, although some people push back again, not reflecting on the fact that punk and heavy metal are derivatives of rock, is derivatives of rhythm and blues, which is we're Afro-diasporic music again. All of Western popular music is all going to be Black music, right? So and for some people, then the step off of that was to say, well, okay, if that's the case, well, we need Swedish folk music again. But these young, rebellious white men in Sweden don't really dig Swedish folk music. They think they should, but they just don't like it that much. I think it's great, right? But that's me. They don't like it, and it's not in their world. And so to me, there was this, this broader history that is actually what was remarkable about rap and reggae was how unremarkable it was. That particular moment was just the latest in a series of kind of white mainstream populations in the West, in the Western world and across the world, taking and appropriating black music and also obscuring the specificity of its roots. This process of saying that it doesn't actually belong to Black people and Africans in the Afro-diasporic world. That was the story. Issuing a sort of moral judgment on it has not been something that I've done. And the one thing that I would point out is there were factions within the radical right who obviously manifest discomfort with that. And the way that they did that was by coming up with all of these ways to try and pull back the Blackness of music. In terms of heavy metal, there were people who said, well, heavy metal really doesn't come from blues. It comes from this older Viking tradition of making a racket, right? Of being cacophonous. And heavy metal music is loud and chaotic sounding. And we're not playing blues or anything like that. We're being Vikings. Similarly, people said, well, these rap artists, these ones in Sweden that had come, they're not really rapping per se. Yes, they're not singing, and yes, there's a beat behind them. But what they're doing is just reciting poetry, and they did that in Old English, and they did that in the Viking eras. That's what the skalds and the bards of Viking Scandinavia did. So no rap, no African, no Black, no nothing. This is actually just a more, and the point of that again is to say actually that they're very insecure, that it does trouble them and it does frustrate their ideas that they're participating in this adoption of non-Swedish music, and that they care that their music manifests their ideal values. So, but I definitely, Laura, your point, I definitely agree with. I mean, that is the story. This is another exercising of access and privilege to be able to manipulate the identities of expressive forms of other people and say when and when they are not tied to specific identities.
Thank you. Thank you.
I add one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
I have another, I just published another article. It's not on the radical right. It's on Swedish Americans in the United States, in Kansas, who have started to speak about Handel's Messiah. If you know what that work is, this big famous choir piece from the Baroque era, Christian oratorio, saying that is Swedish. And my argument there is that their ability to transform the meaning of Handel's Messiah also has to do with the whiteness of Swedishness and of Handel's Messiah. In other words, that when you are in that position, you're freer to redefine the identity of expressive forms than if you were a minority. So.
So I don't know if there are more questions or curiosities. Otherwise, I would free you and thanking you once again for these really inspiring reflections. I think I don't want now to spend words on that, but what I think from a right-wing and radical right literature perspective, if I think about the more promising venues for future research on the radical right, it is one strain of research is exactly how institutionalized and non-institutionalized forms of political participation on the radical right are related. So, as of course you know, there are those scholars that find that the more successful, as you said at the beginning, the more successful the populist radical right in its electoral terms, the more it tends to abstain from protest activities, or generally speaking, social and expressive participation activities. However, there are many actors today that somehow contradict this inverse relation thing. We can think about the alternative to Deutschland and others. So, in which it seems that the electorate success actually is reinforced by the street and also, generally speaking, cultural scene. Think about Pegida. So I think that your research, and so your approach, your research, your perspective on these expressive aspects can be very fruitful, exactly for these emerging but still in need of empirical research strain of research. So thank you, because I really think that the nexus is exactly there, and you with your research you address this nexus from a different angle, not necessarily political. I mean, with political consequences, but not necessarily political as such, whatever political can mean. So thank you, Benjamin, once again. I hope everything will be fine at home. I mean, thank you for participating anyway. And of course, it would be a pleasure to remain in contact. I would like to invite my students, our students, if they have some more questions for you, they can, I think, they can have the permission to write you and drop you an email. Thank you. And so, what else? Thank you. Let's stay in contact. And if you pass by Italy, of course, for a visiting or something, stop at the SNS in our university.
Thank you, Manuel.
Let us updated about your future publications. We also have a Cosmos website, meaning that we have a website for this research center focusing on the study of political participation in social movements, where we upload several publications, news on events, summer schools, winter schools. So if you have also not only publications, but also on these topics, you have something to share with us, please just contact me, and I will refresh our Cosmos website.
That's
okay.
very,
Especially now that all activities have been moved online, so it is not expensive to follow some American, seminaries or other events at your university.
Yes. Thank you so much, Manuel. An absolute pleasure. My apologies for being late. At least the internet held up once I got here. So
okay.
my real apologies.
Bye-bye.
A pleasure. Thank you for the questions too.